Thank you. It's live. How do I know it's recording? Is it? Screen share. Okay, I'm also trying to record this so folks can see it later. Well, that means, oh man, has anyone used Hangout on Air? What's the way to record it? Is this what it is, or is this just playing it? Okay. Chat, Q&A, capture. No. Huh? Which one? I'm trying this. Cameraman. Wow, these are so many options. Yes, broadcast large video and hide the other video. I'm not quite sure. Well, I'm just going to have to hope that this is being recorded, which I really want to be able to share it later, but oh. Okay, no, I don't need that. I don't need to do that. Okay. Oh, what is this? Let's take photo. View photos. I'll just assume it's happening automatically. Okay. So did you get the link to the presentation, Emmett?
Yeah. I'm good. So.
Okay. Okay. So this is your simplest web search. And I'm just going to go over some of this terminology because this is the basic stuff that you will hear a lot and you'll be programming around. Any web server or application on the web consists of these 4 parts. It consists of a domain that is obviously essential, that tells you where your application is running. It consists of what is called a method or a verb, which is hidden from you when you're typing in the URL, but it is sent by your browser to your server. It consists of a part that is after the domain, and that part is variously called the request URI or the path or the route. And usually, and then optionally, after the request URI, there is either a question mark or a hash sign, and then a list of what are called query parameters. And query parameters are written using this format. You can have multiple parameters. They're separated with the ampersand mark, and they come in pairs of key and value. So the key is Q, the value is Oscars 2014. Here the key is SRC, the value is Firefox. Every request made by a browser to any web application uses this format. This format is called HTTP. That's why all of our URLs start with HTTP. HTTP is the definition behind this format. There's a lot more to HTTP than this, but this is good enough to start with. Whenever you click on anything in a browser, it is generating an HTTP request in this format. Okay. So let's look at an example of how that works. Let me go with the Google example. Let's try to bring that back in the screen. Let me know if any of this is too small. So I was saying search and then Q equal to Oscars 2014. Obviously, I've been teaching this class for a while. So the request again, request URI, or the path again, is /search. And I've only inserted one query parameter here. And when I do that, the behavior is the same as if I typed in Oscars 2014 in the search box. So all of the stuff we do in our browsers are just visual aids to basically generating this request. So you can always look at the URL and you can reverse engineer what the request structure is for any website. Okay. So for example, if I wanted to know what parameter to add, if I wanted to do the same search in images, how would I figure out what that parameter is?
You press images and see what changes.
Click on images and see what changes. A lot of things change. So this is really like anytime you want to like figure out, oh, how does this website work? There's a lot of detective here to play, because obviously Google doesn't just care about one piece of information. It cares about a lot of things that you're doing. One of these things that changed, note that Q equal to Oscars 2014 is still there. And then obviously somewhere in the rest of the string, there is the command to Google that says search on images. I happen to know that that is TBM equal to ISCH. If I remove that, I happen to know that it will flip back to non-images. Okay, trial and error. In this case, not really, because I looked at it ISCH. I was like, image search, ISCH. So a lot of like programming and reverse engineering is like these little bits of pattern recognition and playing detective, right? And making guesses. Maybe I would have been wrong. Maybe I thought it's actually SA equal to X. I remove SA equal to X, and I put back TBM equal to ISCH, and it goes to images. So I'm like, oh, it was not SA equal to X. That didn't make a difference. That didn't flip me from image to normal search. So a lot of programming is like trial and error in that sense. The method or the verb is hidden from you. Everything else is shown in the URL. You can also look at the method itself. Most browsers, certainly Firefox, Safari, and Chrome, come with various facilities to help you be a developer. Firefox, the one I use, is called Firebug. It's a plugin for Firefox. And among the many things it does is it shows you all of the requests, and including the method that your browser is sending. This is called Firebug. It's a tool, and if you're using Chrome, it's called Developer Tools instead of Chrome, and you can do something else to start it up. But basically, if I was to make another search, you'll see the display here will start to change. You'll see some of the things have changed, and it's refreshing the screen. So the activity that your browser is engaging in order to refresh the screen is captured using various tools like this. Okay, I'm going to turn that off. Firebug tends to slow down your browser, as you'll discover once you start using it. Is very helpful, but also very slow. Okay, so as far as the language is concerned, any questions? I'll be using a lot of these words again and again. I'll be like, I just started my server. Okay, let's figure out what path I want to type in. When I type this in, let's pass in a few query parameters. What are the query parameters we passed in? So you have to get kind of used to that language. It also helps to know this vocabulary, because this is what you'll be searching for on the internet when you have a question. So for example, notice that if query parameters are separated by ampersand, how would you put the ampersand character itself inside the value of a query parameter? Because as the browser looks at it, every time it sees the ampersand, it says, oh, that's a separator. It is separating one set of query parameters from the next. But if I want to say, no, it's not a separator, it's an ampersand, pass that over to the server, how does the browser do that? You can search on the internet, but you have to know that what you're searching for is, how do I put an ampersand in query parameters in my browser? And then most probably the first answer will be from Stack Overflow, and the answer will be what you're looking for. So let's actually do that. So if I say, how do I put an it's actually not from Stack Overflow, but that's okay. So you'll see there's a bunch of answers. One is from Wikipedia, and you have to kind of look around how to write valid URL query string parameters. I would probably look at that. Some developer person has written some information here. Here it is. Stack Overflow is a website that a lot of developers use to exchange information and learn from each other. And I can see that it is using a word called encoding. I happen to know that that's what you need to do. You need to know how to encode the ampersand, so I would have clicked on this. But at the beginning, you're going to spend a lot of time clicking on a lot of links. You won't go far off the track if you start at Stack Overflow. It's a really good site. Okay. Oops, sorry. So this is what I was talking about. This is sort of more detailed description of each of those parameters. The terms that I have put in bold in this page are the words that are typical in Rails. Rails and Ruby, you'll find, are what are called opinionated languages. So they have a very strong opinion about how to describe things. One of the consequences of being an opinionated language is that you tend to use words that no one else uses. So for example, most people call the URI or the path, that URI or path. In Rails, they're called routes. So you just have to get used to that. Everyone else will be calling them URIs or paths, and in Rails, you're accustomed to calling them routes. In Rails, I think verb is not specific to Rails, but a lot of other people call it method, and Rails calls it verbs. Like I said, browsers have developer tools that help you visualize traffic, and you can use that to play around. Okay, so that's your basic web server, and that's how your browsers talk to web servers. So we're going to jump from there to how that happens in Rails. So we'll keep coming back to this, and really the goal of this next hour and a half is to try and get through the whole thing, to show you all of the Rails commands that get through this whole thing, which is I call the minimum Rails setup. What happens when your Rails application receives that request, right, with the route and the query parameters and the method? How does it process the request? How does it run the code? How does it know what code to run? And how does it know what to send back to the browser? And we'll try also to get to another piece, which is how does it interact with databases? And we will get to that. We will get to some aspects of that. So I'm not going to worry too much about this because these are all terms that we're going to try and learn in the course of this in this session. But the first thing that Rails cares about is what is called the routes file. Okay, so when you write your Rails application, the first thing that decides which routes your application can respond to is your routes file. So we know, for example, that Google responds to a route called /search, right? Somewhere in the server, there's code that says, if you look for the route /search, I will do something about it. If I look for another route, like /foobar, Google will tell me that's an error. Google does not know the route /foobar. So that's really what you need to know about any application is which routes is it aware of. And in Rails, that information is stored in the routes file. So this is actually the full loop. You send a method and a URI. You look for it in the routes file. The code is inside something called the controller. The routes file tells the application, look for the code that will address this request inside a controller. Then something happens when the code runs to pass a bunch of data, which I'm calling instance variables here, to something called the view. And the view is what generates the HTML that your browser is going to see, essentially. Okay. So the three pieces we're going to look at right now is first of all the routes file, which is the list of all routes. Makes sense. The controller and the view. Okay. The controller is the code that runs in order to process your request, and the view is the code that generates the HTML that's going to show up in your browser. The view and controller are names given to these pieces of an application: the code, the processing code, and the generation, the HTML generation. And along with the last piece, which is called a model, they constitute a framework called the Model View Controller Framework. And this is really kind of a visual representation of that framework without the model piece of it. The model piece of it is the actual data, right? Like notice that in this whole thing, like where's the data? There's no data for your application. Your application is receiving a request, running, processing the request, but it needs to, at this point, also talk to the data. So what is missing here in this representation of the Model View Controller Framework is the model. But those are the three pieces that you'll hear this a lot from other frameworks as well. Ruby on Rails is one example of an implementation of a Model View Controller Framework. There are others. So Python, if you code in Python, I think Django is a popular MVC, Model View Controller Framework. PHP has something called Zend, Z-E-N-D. So you could code in PHP and you would use a Zend, and Zend would have its own version of routes files and controllers and views and actions. Python and Django have its own way of describing the same thing. But the flow is always the same. Look up the route, go to the controller, use a model to get data, use a view to figure out the HTML, and send it back to the browser. It's always the same flow. Okay, so we're actually now ready to start typing stuff. Is anyone here going to try and follow along with me? You are. And you are. What's your name? Ondine. Nice to meet you. Have you been coding in Rails or Ruby before, or are you just picking up? Okay.
Always using practice.
Sure. And I know you've been here before, but I forget your name. Ken. Good to see you again. Cool. So yeah, stop me if you have questions. You're like, I tried to run rake, it didn't work. What's going on? And I'll try to follow along. I will be trying to get through that whole loop as much as possible, just to give you a flavor of all the things you would be learning. Oh, and by the way, next week's class is also called Intro to Rails, but if you've noticed on the Rails Bridge mailing list, there's a survey, and the idea is that Brad is asking everyone to vote on what you would like to go kind of deeper into. So he made a list in the survey. You could say, well, I really loved that thing he said about models. I wish I knew more about it. You can vote for that, and then he will teach the class that most people vote for. So if you haven't seen the list, email from him already. I think if you subscribe to the Rails Bridge list, you could get to the archives. But if you can't get to it, just email me, samir@railschool.org, or email all of us, team@railschool.org, and we can get you the survey link. Okay, so I'm going to start actually coding, and follow along if as much as you can. So in this, everything you do with Rails apps, you do with one of two commands: Rails and rake. Okay. Here's a brief rundown of what specifically you do with each. Rails is used to do three things mostly: create your application's files, start your server, and automate the creation of various things. I said model creation, that you can do more than that. So you know that your application is going to have models, views, and controllers. You could write every bit of code yourself, or you could use plenty of helper commands that Rails comes with to set up your models and views for you. And I'll be showing you a lot of those helper commands. And I'll be pointing out places where, really this is just code. You could have written it yourself, but Rails gives you a way to do it very fast. So using a lot of the automated file generation is helpful to prototype your apps. So one of the benefits of a framework is that you can prototype stuff really fast, and Rails is particularly good at that. Okay, let me just check. No Hangout questions. Everyone is still here. I'm still live. That's awesome. Okay, so I will start by creating an application. And maybe I'll just start a folder. I will say Rails new, and I will give this application a name. Okay, so I'll call it Rails. And the Rails takes two arguments. It takes a subcommand. It takes a subcommand, and it takes sub-subcommands, basically. So the structure here is, here's the subcommand, and then this will itself take another argument. If the subcommand is new, it takes the name of the app. Okay, and what that does is that it creates a bunch of files for you, and it also creates a folder whose name is the name of your app. There's a lot of stuff here, but I will point out that it created a folder called app, and inside this folder I will point out three things: models, controllers, and views. So already you can see that Rails is trying to like set up the structure of your files to reflect the fact that it's a model view controller framework. And the way that Rails sets these files up is all part of what is sometimes referred to as Rails magic, or like the opinionated part of Rails. Like this is basically Rails saying your app needs to look like this. Okay. Among the many things that it needs to look like is in app, you will have a folder called app. You'll have a folder called config. Inside app, you will have a bunch of folders, and that's where your controllers and models and views will sit. You can't change this. If you change this, your Rails application won't work, right? So there's no way to say, hey, like I really don't like things being broken up into so many folders. I want everything to be in one folder. You can't do that. Okay, so that's part of how Rails sets things up. Notice that I'm using the command line. So when I was in temp, I did cd app. Now I'm inside my Rails, my app folder, and this location, which is the folder in which all of my apps files are there, is referred to as the app root. So a lot of the times I'll say you should be inside your app root if you're going to run this command, okay? Or you'll see it on the internet when people are explaining what you have to do, like go to your app root folder, look in there, or something like that. So the folder inside which all of your files sit at sort of the top level is called the app root folder, and then the controller model view framework inside that. Okay, so like I said, the first thing we have to do is we want to create routes, right? So to motivate this discussion, what I like to do is to start with a website that lists all of the mayors in the United States. And I'm going to try and get us to, like, quote unquote, duplicating this app, right? So for example, if I say, find me the mayor of Oakland, it tells me what the mayor is. So quick review, what is the domain in this URL? usmayors.org. What's the path or route in this URL? Yeah. Specifically, actually, it is /database search6.asp. Be very, very exact about it. Your route starts after the name of the server, and it includes the slash. What that means is, if you look at, if you type in Google by itself, and this is new. This example used to work. It doesn't anymore. Anyway, if I type in google.com, just the domain name without a route, notice that my browser will still work. But basically, it is acting as if you put a slash at the end of it. So if I put a slash, it kind of removes it, because it's like, oh, well, if your route is just slash, I'm going to ignore it. I'm not going to show it in the browser address bar. But the plain route slash is called the root of your application. That's just a name used. So that's my route. How many query parameters does this URL have? Everyone agrees? One. And what's the key of the query parameter? Search value. The key is everything before the equal to. And the value in this case is Oakland. So obviously, if I say San Francisco, I would get Edwin Lee. I mean, I say obviously, but there's nothing obvious about that. It was just a guess. Maybe like they had coded it so that it's SFO, right? Like, who knows? But I did that. If you pick a city of which there are multiple cities, turns out their app decides for you which Springfield to pick, right? So there must be a way to fix that, but you can again do play detective and figure it out. Like if I wanted to check out Springfield, Massachusetts, what would I do? And you can play detective to figure out how they differentiate between the two. Anyway, so I'm going to build this app, right? And obviously not for real. I can't write all of the HTML that does all this cool stuff and puts the mayor's photo, but I'll pretend as if I'm doing that. So in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very simple thing that if I said something like mayor, question mark, city name equal to Oakland, my app turn the name Gene Kwan. Okay? Very simple, very basic app. That's all my app does. Okay? It's going to respond to this request. Obviously, my app doesn't sit on this domain. It is going to be sitting on my local machine. To access anything running on your local machine, you type in localhost. That is just a convention. Okay? And it's been that way for many years, that your local machine is referred to in your browser as the word localhost. And this is, in fact, not yet complete, but we'll see why in a minute. Okay, so the first thing I have to do is I have to create a route, right? And in this case, the route I'm trying to create is /mayor. Okay? So I'm going to go to a file, which is this file, routes.rb in the folder config. So this is how you do command line. This is another command line trick or way you refer to files, is that you can type in the full path to your file and separate the folder names with a slash. Right? So I could have accessed that file by either changing into the folder and then opening up the file. The file like that, or I can do this, which is open up the file routes.rb in the folder config. And this is a notation to sort of say in the folder, right? This is called a file path separator.
Hey Samir, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is there this is Tam. I'm sorry, I'm online. Is there a way on the Google Hangout I can see what you're doing when you're in a web browser, but I think when you go to the command line, the Google Hangout just stays with the web browser.
Well, I will change my screen share to be my whole screen, which I wasn't doing because I'm always worried about the bandwidth here. So if you guys find like it's getting flaky, just let me know. But for now, I'll just share my whole screen.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thanks, Tam. Thanks for noting that I was only sharing the browser and you couldn't see my command line. Okay, so we are now in my routes file. Notice that Rails does a lot of stuff for you. Among the things it does is it gives you some helpful information about how to write routes. If you have not coded in Rails, none of this makes any sense to you. But as you start to code, at least in the beginning, it's really helpful to have this, right? Like you will, for example, learn what this means, and it's very nice to have a little example down here once you've learned it. Once you've coded for like a week or two, you will know all this, and you're like, I'm done. But I think it's really cute that the people that built out the Rails framework did this, and we'll see a few more examples of the cute way in which they help people that are real beginners. Though the novelty wears off really fast. As I said, in a week or two, you've learned all that stuff, and it's really useless for you. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a route. Let's not worry about what I'm typing here for now. I will just type. What I will point out is that what I typed in is Ruby code. All of this is Ruby code. If you know Ruby, you're like, oh, I see what's happening. If you don't know Ruby, you kind of have to remember this format, right? And you have to memorize it. You're like, oh, well, the way I add a route is I type the name of the method, I then type the name of the route, I then use this thing which is called a hash rocket symbol, I then do this thing, blah, 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 right? So I get asked this a lot, should I know Ruby to code in Rails? Well, if you're going to do any serious coding, yes. because otherwise you're going to have to memorize so much of this stuff, like it'll just be impossible, right? So you knowing Ruby helps, right? So yes, learn Ruby. Yes, get familiar with the Rails tools in parallel, but try to catch up on Ruby as fast as you can. Right? So notice that the way that this is structured is that it uses English language terms in a way that you can sort of guess at what's going on. You already know that get is a method. You already know that the route is written this way. And the hash rocket symbol sort of says, if you get this route, go here. So a lot of the structure of how Rails is set up to like give you these little mnemonics to help it make it easier for you to code. These mnemonics are called DSL, domain specific language. So people will say, hey, like Rails has a DSL. Many of the libraries you will use in Rails have their own DSLs. And many of them are written so that the DSL tends to be intuitive, at least in the beginning. Okay? So a library that, for example, connects to Facebook will probably have a command that says something like login, or it says something like Facebook underscore profile underscore image. And it will probably do what you think it's going to do. Login will be a method that will let your application create a login into Facebook for the user. I'm making this example up. That's not actually the way it is in the Facebook plugin. But the idea that the libraries are set up that way is usually referred to as supplying a domain-specific language, DSL. Okay, so we'll try to like understand how much of the DSL. We're trying to understand some of the DSL, but the total like DSL, the depth of knowledge is pretty big, right? So a lot of like really learning Rails is like getting familiar with the DSL and getting familiar with all of the possible commands out there, and then memorizing and then having stacks of manuals or knowing how to search for it on Stack Overflow. So let's see what happens when I have this running. I'm going to open another window so that I can run my server in that window. And Rails server. Rails new. Rails server starts your server for you. Hopefully I have that up on my screen. Yeah. Okay. So we did this. Now we're doing this. Simple change in my app, and that is all I needed to do before I start my server. Okay. So I kind of want to emphasize the. Oh, come on. Yeah, ignore that stuff I did. Ignore this because I don't want to confuse. Sorry for that interruption. Okay, Rails server. Let's assume that all the stuff in between did not happen. And if we have time, I'll try to explain why I had to do all that. Notice it says Rails application is starting. It is starting at HTTP this thing, colon this thing. So I want to point out that there are two ways in which you can describe any server. You can describe it using a name, like google.com, or you can describe it using what's called an IP address. An IP address is 4 numbers separated by dots. The convention, just like localhost is the name of your local machine, is that the IP address of your local machine is the number 0000, separated by dots. Every computer in the world has an IP address, which is why we've run out of them, or we are going to run out of them, because there are way too many computers. But basically what this is saying is that your server is now running on localhost. It is also running on something called the port. So with. Um, so you could separate those out by having them run at what are called different ports. A typical machine can have up to 65,000 ports. So you can have 65,000 applications listening in each at their own port. Rails, by default, when you set it up to start off with, will run the server at port 3000. That's just a Rails default. Okay. The way you tell your browser is you type in :3000 after the name of the server. The reason you never type this into your browser, you never say :anything in your server is running at some port. But none of us are accustomed to typing in a port number like this into our browser address bar. Any guesses? It's the same reason that you don't have to say / at the end of the browser, like if you're just using the default, the root route, which is that browsers come with a lot of defaults written into them. And the default is that if a browser is not given a port number, it will attempt to contact the server at port number 80. And a lot of these conventions, there's no meaning behind that number. 40 years ago, someone decided that when they set up a server, they will handle mail at port number 22, I think. They will handle browser requests at port 80. They will handle FTP requests at port 21, I think, and so on and so forth. Someone just decided this, and they made a list of ports, and they decided that way. And to this day, all browser servers by default, all web servers by default are listening in at port 80. All browsers are written to assume that if you don't give them a port, they will communicate with port 80. Okay, I will press enter. It will connect to my application. It will generate an error. Let's look at the application. Whoa, a lot of stuff happened. You obviously got an error because you can't just do one thing. You still have to write the controller and the view and the model. We didn't do any of that. But at least it ran. Okay, it ran. It contacted the application. The application tried to respond. Look, it said started this. And then it ran into an error. So the cute thing I was mentioning earlier is that in the beginning, Rails is very good at being very English language about telling you what errors are happening. So you can actually read that and sort of guess. And so these things have been changing in the last 6 months. So every time I do this lesson, I'm like, oh, wait, this is different from last time. So what it says is there's a routing error, and it is not able to find a controller. Notice that the controller it is looking for is prefixed to the word city. The clue here is that in your route file, you said city over here. So basically, what this format does is that it says, hey, the code is inside a controller called city controller. And that is what it is saying. I don't know where the code is. Right? We didn't write the code. So I will write that code now. As I said, specific folder structure. All of your controllers have to be in your root folder /app, meaning the folder app underneath that, then the folder controllers underneath that, and then the actual file. So let me actually show you that in my Finder, so it kind of makes sense. So if I go to temp, and I'm writing my code in Rails School app, here's my stuff. Basically, I need to create a controller here. That's what I'm trying to do, and that's what it's expecting. If you use a tool like RubyMine, it will help you do stuff. Like you can say things like create controller, and then you create the controller. It will then initialize the controller for you doing a bunch of things. For now, I'm just going to type everything, and I will show you a little bit later how Rails lets you automate a bunch of the stuff. But for now, I'll just type it as if I know what I'm doing. About knowing what. And if you know Ruby code, you're like, oh, okay, you're writing a method. my instance variable that I'm defining for this class is this. Bunch of stuff, but basically I created a controller. Okay, that's kind of what I did. I created what is called an action inside the controller. So one controller can have lots of actions. You can take a request, send it to the same controller, but then the second piece of your route says which action in the controller has the code that is going to run. And in this case, the code that is running is a single line which says mayor name equal to Jean Kwan. So again, if you know programming, all I'm doing is assigning a value to a variable, and I will use that variable later at some point. But that's basically what I'm doing. Is it's Ruby code assigning a value to a variable. Okay. Notice that I don't have to restart my server. I just changed the code on my server, but I don't actually have to restart it. I can just go back to the browser and hit refresh. The error changed. Okay, so we made progress. So this is an aspect of coding in Rails, which is not necessarily unique to Rails, which is that you don't have to keep, most of the time, you don't have to restart your server when you're changing your code. Makes it very easy to code and test. Make change, hit refresh. Make change, hit refresh. Don't have to wait for the server to start up again. If anyone here has ever coded in compiled languages, you will know that you have to go through a process of recompiling all your code every time that you make any change, and that takes a long time. In Ruby, you sort of have this like instant gratification. Ruby or Rails, Python, Perl, all of them are the same. You have this very instant gratification kind of thing, right? Make the change, look at it. Make the change, look at it. Okay, so the next message it is saying is that the template is missing. Template actually is the Ruby name for your views. Specifically, it's the the Rails name. Specifically, it's the Rails name for a piece of the whole process of generating your view. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen in order to generate the HTML. One of the things is that the Ruby Rails needs to find a template. Notice that it tells you where it is looking for the template. It says it's looking in city/here. In application/here. So it's saying, hey, I'm trying to find these files. They're not there. And then it is also saying where it looked. And notice that the folder structure that it is giving you is, in fact, the folder structure on my system, right? So it's saying somewhere in the temp file, you have this app, Rails School app. Inside it, you have the app folder. And inside it, you have the views folder. I looked in there. I didn't find your template. Was there a question, John?
Oh, I stepped behind the last step. And I was trying to
Oh, okay.
catch up.
Oh, by the way, I should say that like the actual app, all of the code is up on GitHub. The link to the GitHub is at the beginning of the... It's not. Okay, I'm sorry. I will add a link to where I'm putting the code up on GitHub. So at the end of this, the app that we're building will be available to you to download and use. Okay, so it's saying I'm looking for this template, so I'm going to go write that template. I'm going to go to app view finder. So I'm going to go to app, I'm going to go to views, and in here I'm going to create a new folder called city. And then I'm going to go to my text editor. City. I'm going. So there is a very specific process by which the controller file and the view file are being looked for by Rails. So the process, if you remember in the routes file, we had city pound show mayor. And I'm not opening that because that's a lot of different windows. But the process is, city is the name of the controller, and it is also the name of the folder in which your view will be placed. Show mayor is the name of the action. It is also the name of the view file in which you're going to write your HTML. Okay. So you don't have to have figured out what I just said, but basically the ways in which you construct your view files and the ways in which you construct your controller code has to follow this strict rule. And that's how Rails knows to connect the code inside the controller file to the code inside the view file. Yeah, so there are two pieces in the route. And maybe I will open up the other file. So notice that the route is written this way, right? City, and then there's a pound, and then there's show mayor. These two pieces are called the controller and the action. So what Rails does is it starts from here. It looks for a controller. Name starts with city. It looks for an action, which you define in your routes file. After it executes this code, it will look for the view in a folder whose name is the same as the name of the controller. Your view has to be in that folder. And the file that contains the view code has to be the name of the action. Okay, so you just have to remember this. A lot of Rails guides are pretty good at making you practice this. They'll make you walk through this process again and again. And we'll also see how you can use a lot of helpers to not have to remember this. But I like to sort of jump into the conceptual piece. I'm like, this is really what's happening. And you can use a helper to avoid doing this, but at some point in your Rails development, you're going to need to know that this is what's happening. Right? So I'm trying to connect those dots. Obviously, there's some pieces I've left out. For example, why does my file end with .erb? I'm going to leave that out for now, but this is basically where you're going to generate the HTML that your browser is going to see. Here I'm going to say, hi. So how familiar are people with HTML? With the idea that HTML contains tags, and tags will let you decide the color and the font and how to do bulleted lists and so on. So basically HTML at a very, very basic level consists of tags and content. Content is what is going to be shown. Tags decide how it is going to be shown. Tags are in this form, less than, greater than, and something in between. This tag, the B tag, says this content needs to be shown in bold. When you're writing Rails code, Rails gives you one more tag, which is the tag that says this is Ruby code in here. Okay, so this tag is not part of HTML. It is what Ruby adds when it is what Rails adds to your HTML files to give you a place in which to say run code here. Okay? In this case, the code I'm running is simply outputting the value of this variable. So if you don't know programming and that doesn't make sense, what is the value of a variable? Remember that we set the value here using the equal to sign. So we said this variable, this string here, mayor name, will stand for this name. So it's a pointer, it's a reference to this name. So wherever I type in that name, that is going to be substituted for by the value, variable value. Okay. Let's go back to the browser, and I'm going to hit refresh. My app works. I asked for the mayor of Oakland, and it tells me it's Jean Quan. Obviously, if you ask for the mayor of San Jose, it will also say it's Jean Quan. So it's a very dumb app. But hey, we got somewhere. Notice that I said B, the B tag, and that's why this is in bold. So just pointing out that this tag's in content. If I look at the code that was generated, ignore all of this. Hey, here's our code from our template file. So The template is only part of the view generation process. A lot of other stuff is happening here as well. I can point out, for example, that it is pointing the browser page to a bunch of JavaScript files. Okay, so Rails comes with default JavaScript files and CSS files. So if you've done any HTML programming, you'll know what those are. If you haven't, don't worry about it. But they come as defaults. So all of your JavaScript code and style sheets can be placed in one file, and Rails will automatically append those files into the rendered view. I didn't have to do all of this. I just wrote this little piece, and then Rails put together the rest of the HTML. HTML has certain standards. These tags are part of that standard. Good HTML always uses these tags. HTML is very old technology, so it is very good at maintaining legacy compatibility. So you can write HTML today as if you were writing it in the early 90s, and it will still work on all modern browsers, which I think is somewhat miraculous. This is really like you could put a crankshaft on a brand new Mercedes, and it will still work. Because somehow every car made today comes with every tool that was available in cars of 50 years ago. It's kind of like that. It also means that it's really hard sometimes to get your browser to look right, because some of the behaviors are like legacy behaviors. And you have to know, oh, it behaves in this very specific way because that's how it used to behave in the 90s, and we never changed it, right? So it can be very frustrating. I don't code in the front end at all. I hate coding in HTML and CSS. It makes me want to puke. More power to you if you can do it and want to do it. So I do mostly back-end coding and try to avoid front-end where I can. Okay, so obviously the first thing I want to do is make my app like slightly smart, which means I want it to be aware of the query parameters, right? So that's a reasonable place to start. Quick time check. I can keep going for the next 45 minutes, but I don't want to force you to all sit here. So feel free to get up, go to the bathroom. Any questions? Should I just keep going or take a break if like a lot of people want to get up and leave? I think the answer is no. Okay. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, at a very bare minimum, is be smart enough to recognize that I have query parameters and respond to them. The way that Rails to your app is, I'm trying to make, okay, the way that Rails passes in the query parameters coming in from your browser into your applications is through this variable called params. Many things in Rails have special meanings, which means that you cannot use the same word to do something else. Because if you use it to do something else, you've lost the special meaning. And now the rest of your app will fail to function, right? So if I redefine the value of params, oops, too bad, you lost all of your query parameters. You just have to learn these. I have stumbled and continue to stumble into various aspects like this, part of what is called Rails magic. Hey, by magic, your query parameters are available in this variable called params. But if I didn't know that, sometimes I can create a bug when I didn't intend to. This is a hash in Ruby. If you don't know what that is, no problem. But if you know what it is, you're like, ah, that's what's happening. Rails is creating a hash called params whose keys are the same as the keys in your query parameter string. Okay? Don't know what that means. Just know that you have to say params, and then inside of these bracket symbols, you have to write in the name of your key preceded by a colon. So notice here that my key is city name. So here it is colon city name. I will then say if city is open, okay, so I did two things. I introduced the idea of Rails magic that helps pass the query parameters into your application, and I wrote a tiny bit of Ruby code. Again, if you're coded, this makes sense. I think it kind of makes sense even if you're not coded. It's the conditional. It's saying if the parameter that was passed in was Oakland, then the name of the mayor is this. If it's SFO, then the name of the mayor is this. And now if it works. I have a slightly smarter app. Notice that I didn't have to restart anything. I just added code and it works, right? Okay, so you can see how this can get very laborious. So obviously you don't want to code this way.
So if you put in like San Jose, it'd revert back to J1.
Oh, good question. Any guesses? Are you familiar enough with coding to kind of understand the structure, or you're not? To understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So basically, if none of the conditions are met, then none of this code will be run, right? So which means that the value of the variable will not be initialized, which in the case of Rails means that the variable will be left empty, and most importantly, will not generate an error. Okay. So, okay, good question. So, first of all, there's no error in the app. The app just went its merry way. It had a variable whose value was never initialized, and it sort of continued to work and didn't generate an error. So you asked the question, no 404. So what he means by that is, when an application decides that it is not able to find anything to process your request, it will send back a code called the 404. We saw that when we did this. Okay. So you'll encounter this as well a lot. People will be like, oh no, it's a 404 page. What happened? 404 means missing. Again, XKCD. If you're a geek, you're probably aware of the T-shirt that says 404. I'm not here. But basically, there's a whole lot of error codes that browsers can send back. Servers send back to browsers to inform them that various mistakes have happened. So to answer your question, in fact, Rails is not even sending back a 404. Rails is sending back a 200. 200 is a code for everything is fine, no problems. So you can see that sometimes it is your responsibility as the app developer in Rails to actually generate the error code. We would have had to actually do something in here to say something like else. Okay, so it would be your responsibility. Sometimes if your app really crashes, like you do something that really fails, then Rails will generate an error message for you. So for example, if I write bad code in my file, now if I try to run this bad code, it will in fact generate a non-404 error message. So you didn't generate this 500 error code. Rails generated it for you because Rails tried to run Ruby code that cannot be run, and when that happens, it will automatically generate the error code for you. So some places it will, some places it won't, and you'll just have to discover it yourself over time. Okay, so I'm actually going to jump into model creation just to get a sense of like some of the helpers and like the way that you can actually start to interact with data in a Rails app. Okay, so my idea so far was to give you a sense of the back end-to-end framework, and you could sort of imagine that you could write a whole app without ever worrying about a database, right? Like I could, if my app was to list all the mayors in San Francisco, in the country, I could write 350 different if statements and have a way of doing that. Or I could do it better by writing a database into which I put that data and so on and so forth. Right? So I'm going to sort of point out like how we do that. And in order to do that, I am going to do a few things. I'm going to create models, and I'm going to use Rake to initialize a database. So I'm going to use that as an example to like highlight some of the other tools and commands. And we already looked at this. I think that's as far as the presentation goes. So most of it is in code. Okay, so the next step that we're going to do, I'm going to introduce two concepts. One is what is called RESTful routes or resources, and the other is models. Okay. So the idea of RESTful routes is, notice that I have this app where I can inquire about the mayor of Oakland. Once I have lots of mayors, I might want to do something like, hey, give me all the mayors. Once I have mayors, I might want to do something like edit the mayor, right? There is a small list of typical things any app will do. They will create things, create data. They will read data and show it to you. They will update data, which is kind of like, well, create, except it's already there, and you're just updating the value. So I could update the mayor of Oakland because there was an election, and I now have a new mayor. I have a new city that has never had a mayor. I'm going to create a mayor. So you create, read, update, and you could delete information. These are the four things that you typically do with your data. That is called, that set of actions is commonly combined and called the set of CRUD actions. CRUD. Create, read, update, delete. Rails comes with a bunch of helpers that let you instantly create all the controllers, all the views, and the model you need to create, to do CRUD actions on any data you want. Okay? So what we did in our code, laboriously typing it out, was to do one action, read, on one model. And we didn't even really create the model, right? We kind of coded it, hacked it up. If I was to write a full app, I would do something like this. Okay? This would be very laborious. I don't want to waste my time. So is I'm going to generate. So this is a Rails command, subcommand generate, subcommand scaffold. In the scaffold, I'm going to say, give me all of the CRUD commands for something called mayor, which is the data that I want to manipulate. And then I'm going to type in a list of what are called attributes. So mayor name and age.
Does this need to happen from the config directory?
This needs to happen, good question. So any of these commands, Rails server, Rails generate, and we'll see commands under Rake, need to happen anywhere underneath the Rails root folder. Anywhere underneath. Okay, I could run this command here. Oops. I could run this command in this folder. I could run it in the root folder. I could go and run it. It doesn't matter where, but it has to be underneath the root of your app. That's all it has to do. Rails will then figure out where the root of your app is. It will figure out where all the other files are and do the magic it needs to do. Okay, so you don't have to worry about it.
I just want to back up one step.
Yeah.
How do you get to your root folder once you exit out?
So in the command line, to move up in the hierarchy, you do what I just did here.
So you,
Dot dot.
okay.
So moving up is dot dot. Moving down, you just say which folder you want to move down to, but moving up is dot dot. You can think of it as up, down, back, forth, whatever. Like obviously, if you're using something like Finder, it's like move left, move back. So whether I say up, down, I usually when I'm like, hey, go up one folder, I use up and down. I guess that's my default orientation. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're saying that we want to create a bunch of CRUD actions for a piece of data called mayor. And not only do we have to say what our data what is the data that we're trying to manipulate. We also have to say what are the attributes for that data. Typically, any piece of data you have, you're creating a website for shopping, e-commerce. You have products. Products have attributes. They have a price. They have a name. They have discount values and so on. You have users. Users have names and ages and profiles and URLs and so on. So every time you create data, you have to have a name for the kind of data it is. Like it's a user, it's a product, it's a book, it's a whatever. But then you also have a list of attributes. Each of those attributes also come with what are called data types. And so there are various reasons for saying what is the data type. You don't always have to do that. If you guys have heard of like the debate between SQL and NoSQL databases, NoSQL databases, one of the features is that your data doesn't have to have types. All your data is simply strings. You can think of it that way. But if you're using SQL databases, you're going to give types. Any guesses as to why data has types? Why it would benefit for you to like think about the types of your data? Videos or photos. So you're saying that if it's a video, you want to know it's a video, because how does that change the way you make your application? Was that?
The size,
Right, storage.
access.
The way you access it, yeah. So usually the reason you have data types is that the database will function better if you say what is what. If you say something is a number, it will know how to optimize the storage of a number versus storing it as a string. So there is a reason you have to specify what your data type is. It's not just random, right? So basically, I'm pointing out why the structure is this way. But what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to store mayors, and every mayor will have a name. That name will be a string. Every mayor will have an age, and that age is an integer. Okay. It does place certain constraints. It means that I don't intend for my mayor's ages to be half fractions. I don't want to store the age 5.5, 25.5. Right? So I am making a decision. By choosing it to be an integer, I'm making a decision about the design of my app. When I do this, it will tell you that it is generating a bunch of files. Notice that it created a bunch of views. It created one controller, and all of the actions are inside the one controller. The names of the views, unfortunately, don't map to the letters CRUD. I wish they did, because then life would be so easy. But the new HTML, this is the HTML that will be generated when you want to create a mayor. Edit will be the HTML that's generated when you want to edit the value of a mayor. Index means list all of them. Okay, so the CRUD action, you could actually think of it as like LCRUD, I guess. So you're creating, reading, updating, deleting, and listing. Listing meaning give me everything that's in the database for that type of data. So that's what there's one view for each of the possible CRUD actions, and then the code that will address all of those is inside this file. So I'm going to open up that file, and notice that it has actions that correspond to each of the CRUD actions. And it has already filled in a bunch of code. If I'd had to do this myself, I would have had to type all of this. So of course the upside is, hey, I get this code for free. And it does a bunch of things. For example, if there are errors in creating a mayor, when it tries to create the data, it runs into some error. It is already coded to handle errors, and so on and so forth. So scaffolding is great for prototypes, right? What that means is I can now go back to my app, and I can say, hey, give me and if I did one more thing, it would actually run, but I run into this error But notice that it is actually able to recognize this route. The error that you get is not routing error. So if you remember, like when we first started, or if I type in like a route exist, oh, I can't get that error unless I finish this little piece. Okay, so try to get that to work. So I guess I really should point out that the next thing you have to do is what are called migrations, and that is sort of my motivation to explain the rake command. So like I said, in Rails, there's two commands you have to get familiar with. One is Rails. We have seen it used to create the application in the first place. We've seen it used to start your server. The other app, then we have seen Rails being used to automate a bunch of stuff that we just automated to produce a lot of code. And now you're going to use the rake command to actually initialize the database. So the thing to know about Rails is that your code and your database are separate. When you create code for manipulating certain types of data, it doesn't automatically create the corresponding data in the database. You have to go and actually do that. So the process of initializing a database to be able to be manipulated by the code that we just generated here is called migrating or running migrations. So every time you write code that requires a change in the database structure, you will end up having migrations that you have to run. And that's what this error message is telling us here, that I just created something called mayor, but I didn't finish the job of initializing the database to start being able to store my mayor data. Okay, so that's the next step that I have to do. So the way I do that is I use the rake command, and then I pass a subcommand to the rake command, which in this case is db:/migrate. And we won't go into all of the possible ways in which you can give subcommands to rake, but basically db is database, and migrate says complete the pending migrations, is what is happening here. So it says it's doing the migrations, it created a table, and it's done. What that now does is I can call this route and note that it says it is listing mayors, it says what the attributes of each mayor are, and it gives me a helpful link to create a new mayor. When I click on that link, it gives me a helpful form to actually create a mayor. I can then create a mayor this way. I can then say that the age, it in fact knows that because it's an integer, it gives me a little toggle here, and I can use the toggle to change the age. Or I can type it in right there, and I can say create mayor. So what happens with scaffold is that you got a bunch of bare bones code that did a lot of stuff, controller view model, without having to type all of this stuff in. Great for prototyping, but now you have kind of the structure that you kind of got handed. If you have to figure out how to change any of that structure, you have to figure out the code that that Rails generated, and sort of reverse engineer it from there. If you read the literature, well, the literature. If you read people's debates on the internet, should you use scaffolding or not? Inevitably, it says use it for like when you're a beginner, and then stop using it. Scaffolding will sort of inculcate a lot of bad habits. You're sort of like accustomed to doing things the way Rails sets them up for you. Might not be the best way to write an app. You won't always know how things are working because you're kind of just using it without really questioning. So you'll inevitably get like a lot of debates where people are like, no, scaffolding is terrible. Rails guides, in fact, doesn't even mention scaffolding. So if you read the Rails guide, you'll be like, where is that scaffolding thing he was talking about? So it's actually not there. But I like to show it because in this 2-hour class, it's like, whoa, look at all the stuff you can do. Specifically, the one thing that scaffolding, it shows to create a whole bunch of routes in one go. Okay, so note that the scaffolding did not add many routes like this. Mayor that are now available, the thing that scaffolding does for you is that it's called resources in your routes file. If you do any Rails programming, you'll find that you go to pretty much every routes file in every app is 80% resources. It's like a long list of all the resources available, right? So your typical e-commerce app will have something like resources products, resources buyers, resources, I don't know, discount information, and so on and so forth. So you'll see a long list of resources, which gives you like sort of this quick view into like, oh, these are the things that my app cares about. And if the coder is a good coder, they have used words that make sense, right? They haven't said resources, widgets, resources, toolbars. And then you're like, what the hell is a widget in this app, right? It should say things like resources books, resources toys, so that you can look at it and be like, oh, okay, this looks to be an app that helps you deal with books and toys. Resources doctors, resources appointments, resources clinics. Ah, okay, it's an appointment app for doctors and clinics, right? So when you look at example applications, like look at the config file, look at all the resources, and that'll give you a sense of like, okay, this is how the app is structured, right? So I like to use scaffold for those two reasons. Like, oh, not only do I get to like, hey, play around like this, now I created a mayor. Now notice that if I ask for a list of all mayors, I get one mayor named Jean Kwan. If I create another mayor, create this mayor, and I go back to the list of all mayors, whoa, here's another mayor. All of this stuff is actually also coming out of your database. So this means that the scaffolding also lets you like create the database and create all of the HTML that generates the requests needed to initialize the database, edit the database, and so on. Right? So I could go to this link, and then I can edit the values of the mayor. The structure of Rails default routes is said to be RESTful. Okay, usually written like that. Uppercase R-E-S-T, lowercase full. The idea of a RESTful route is that the path starts with the name of a resource, or you could think of it as a data entity, or a piece of data. It then contains an ID that identifies a specific row in your database or a specific instance of that data, and then it contains an action. What do you want to do with that data? So the idea that you construct your routes in this format, which is the data I want to manipulate, the specific instance of that I want to manipulate, and what I want to do with it, is referred to as a RESTful representation of your route. I can write my app to behave like this, for example. Right? So instead of saying slash ID slash action, I could pass in a bunch of query parameters. Somewhere around like, I don't know, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, RESTful routes became really, really common. If you see an app that is structured like this, you can be fairly certain it was written pre-2005. Pre-2005, like this was pretty much how most apps behave. You had a route, and then you had a bunch of query parameters, and then your app would like take all the query parameters and then do something with it. Okay. Somewhere, like I said, 8 or 10 years ago, this was deemed less easy to read than something like that. Okay, and this is a way of making more RESTful routes. I don't know. I guess because I've been coding for so long, like my brain can read both things and kind of figure it out, right? So when I look at the google.com/q equal to this and whatever, it doesn't look weird to me, but I can see the point that this is actually a lot easier to read, especially when you have nested routes. So if I had books, if I had a blog, let's say, I would have something like post 21, review comments. So that RESTful route says, give me the 15th comment on the 21st post. And you, I think that makes sense. Like you sort of get used to that, and you get used to the nested structure, and it really helps reflect the way your database is structured. It's like, oh, okay, in this database, all the comments are attached to the posts, and is reflected in the fact that your RESTful routes are written this way. So it's a way. RESTful routes are a way of like making your app sane for someone else to read, right? Like you wrote this app. If instead I had it be something like this, display equal to this, and comments equal to, you could say, well, wait, is this the 15th comment on the 21st post? Or is it give me 15 comments on the 21st post? Or is it give me 21 posts, and then give me the 15th comment of each of those 21? Like, what does that mean?
Is that not considered RESTful?
So this is not RESTful. This is not RESTful because it is not representing the entities in that format, which was what I had earlier, which is start with the main entity, identify the specific instance, or nested. Start with the main entity, identify the nested entity beneath that entity that you're trying to get to. So this is considered to be a RESTful route.
Is it a acronym or abbreviation or something? Why do they call it?
Yes. REST. I have read and reread the Wikipedia entry on this, and I'm not able to figure out why what it describes is representational state transfer. The original paper on REST routes is like very like abstract and talks about how do you maintain, like, how do you represent state in a database, and how do you say like, hey, the database now is like this. I did X action and it became this way. And it talks about the models for like representing the state changes. So it really doesn't talk about web browsers and web applications, but it is used to describe the interaction of browsers with databases where there is a change in state happening. So I think that's the best I can describe that. Okay. So I have one thing that I want to cover, which is the Rails console, which gives you a sense of how you can manipulate your data. I guess any questions or suggestions on what you would like to maybe cover as opposed to that? Just checking questions here. No. Okay. Anything specific that you're like, well, you know, I kind of want to know how like XYZ happens, as opposed to looking at the console? No.
What you already demoed is awesome. Just adding values to a database in order to create a list of users that have specific things is.
Yeah, well, the prototype aspect of it that's the really cool part about Rails, right?
Well, so I guess what's the next step? We are prototype.
Well, so let's look at this app. I figured out how to like get access to all the mayors, but I actually did not figure out how to do this anymore. What I stored is a list of mayors. I forgot to store the connection of mayors to cities, right? So one next step could be that we figure out how to create a model for cities, store all the cities in the database, and then figure out how to make associations between the cities and the mayors.
So where are these stored? Do we have MySQL?
Yeah, so I was actually going to show that. I was going to answer that question, but if we had had more time, like I could have tried to like show, well, okay, we did mayors. Now let's do cities. Hey, we got cities. Now let's connect the two. But we won't quite have the time for that. But let me actually do the show you kind of where it is in the database. So where it is in the database physically is it is inside, and there's a file here called development.sqlite3. By default, Rails comes with the SQLite database. SQLite is a SQL database. Other SQL databases are MySQL, Postgres. I can't think of another common SQL database, but MySQL and Postgres are probably the other two most common ones. SQLite is a light SQL database. It exists on a file, so you don't actually have to install a database server to actually have access to the database. That's why it's very easy for prototyping. If you deploy your app to Heroku, for example, which is a cloud service for deploying your apps, you are not allowed to use SQLite. SQLite is slow, SQLite is insecure, SQLite has lots of bugs, because it's never meant to be a production-grade server. It's meant to give you a way to like set up servers, a set of databases, without having to install servers. If you wanted to use Postgres, you would have to install the Postgres server and run it on your machine and jump through a bunch of hoops to figure out how to configure a database on Postgres. SQLite with Rails, no work at all, right? We just did scaffold and boom, like all my data is now inside this database. Using yet another subcommand of the Rails command called console. When I say Rails console, again, anywhere in underneath my root folder. Okay, it doesn't matter where. I can be inside the DB folder. It will set up another command line interface, which is already built to connect to your server. Why did that happen? Ignore that error. I have caused havoc on my machine the last couple of days, which is why you saw the earlier error in this one. You should not have seen that. Rails console should just put you in this console command. So this is another command line, meaning it is another text interface to a bunch of commands. The Rails console command line comes with its own commands that help you manipulate the console, which are different from the commands of your actual command line on your machine. So I think one thing that once you get into command lines, it gets confusing is like, which command line am I in, right? Like, you know, if I do ls, it's like, whoa, ls didn't work. Wait, I thought I can list files. Why doesn't that work? The way you can keep track is look at this, which is called your command line prompt. So your prompt is kind of guiding you to tell you what you're doing right now. And this prompt, IRB, parentheses main, blah, 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 is the default prompt for the Rails console. So at this point, I'm in the Rails console. To get out, I hit Control-D. And now I'm in my Mac OS shell console. How do I know that? Because it's telling me the folder I'm in. So that's the prompt. I start the console back again, and it will generate the errors. Please ignore those and generate the prompt. What that lets me do is that it lets me access the database. But you don't access the database by actually constructing a SQL command in the Rails console. You access the database using models, which is a Ruby code used to interface with the database. I have a model called Mayor. Remember I said Rails generates scaffold Mayor? That word Mayor was the name of the model that I'm creating, and the name of the model around which I created the whole scaffold. What that means is in my console, I can do this. And it will return a list of all mayors in my database. The specific format, don't worry about it right now. Just notice that here it says mayor ID 1. Here's the name, here's the age, and it ends there. Then it says mayor ID 2, name, age, it ends there. Each of these represents a row in your database. And you're accessing the rows in the database by using Ruby code, which uses models. So a lot of like understanding how to like deal with your data is understanding how Ruby models, Rails models work. And what are all of the domain-specific language commands available to you to use your models to interface with your data. Okay, so we talked about DSLs. There's DSLs for everything. There's DSLs for generating HTML. There's DSLs for accessing your data. There's DSL for, like I said, for all the libraries that you'll use. But I think the very first thing you'll do after you sort of get comfortable, run Rails, you know, set it up on your system, you maybe generate a scaffold, you play it around, the first thing you'll do is get familiar with the DSL for models. given a model, I can get a list of all rows in the database with all. I can get the first row in the database with first. I can get the last row in the database with last. I can create an entry in the database with create. And I need to supply two attributes, the name and the age. And the way I do that is name, Bob Smith, and here's the age. He is 78. All my mirrors are really old. Notice that it tells you what it is doing. It is beginning a transaction. It is inserting into mayors. It is doing blah, blah, blah. It is committing the transaction. Transactions are a term from database manipulation. Starting a transaction means I am now talking to the database. Committing a transaction means I successfully told the database what to do. I wrote this piece of Ruby code. It knew, or I should say I wrote this piece of model domain-specific language. It knew what to do to talk to the database to create a record in the database that stored the information I was interested in storing. Which means also that when I go back to my app, it is now in my database. Okay, so the console is kind of your backend access to the database. It is something you'll use a lot when you're developing. You're like playing around, you're putting data, seeing what happens. So the console is a way for you to quickly make changes in the database to see what happens. You would never, ever use the console to access your production app. If you do it, you must look very carefully at every single thing you're typing before you press enter, because you're basically looking at your production data from the backend, right? And you have none of the, well, you don't have some of the built-in validations that you've hopefully written in your app, right? So for example, I might have validated, I haven't, but I should, for example, say that this is not okay. Right now it's okay. I can have negative ages. So if I'd written in my app, hey, if you get a negative number for age, send back an error. If you use the console, you might not have, the console kind of has direct access to the database. So you have to be very careful when you're using console because you might be circumventing the security and validations you've written into your app. So notice that this is the information that I inserted, but Rails has inserted a bunch of other stuff. Specifically, it inserts 3 extra attributes for every piece of data that you add to the database. The date on which the data was created in the database, the last time that it was updated, and an ID. This is part of Rails being opinionated. You don't have to, when you design a database, have an ID that uniquely identifies every row in your database. You don't have to. There's nothing in databases that sort of dictates that is necessary. Rails decides that when it manipulates the database for you, it will uniquely identify every single row in every table with a number. And it will manage that number for you. You typically don't get to change that number, right? And you don't need to, but it's kind of happening behind the scenes. So this is, again, part of Rails magic. Once you have that, you can call back a specific mayor by using yet another command in the model DSL called find. So if I say find my mayor whose ID is 3, note that now I have a variable m whose value is the data in my database for the mayor whose ID was 3. So this is my model that helps me do the access. I then get the value and store it in this variable. And then I can continue to do things like show me the name of the mayor, show me the age of the mayor, using more Ruby notation. So again, like a lot of this stuff, you can read a Rails guide and not know Ruby, and you sort of get used to saying, oh, I guess I do dot. I don't know why I'm doing dot, but I guess I do it. Why do I do mayor dot find? Can I do mayor colon find? What does that do? If you know Ruby, you know you can't, and you know what it means to put a dot, right? If you don't know Ruby, you kind of just learn that. You're like, oh, it's like there's a dot there, and you pass the name of the attribute after the dot, and it works that way. But if you know Ruby, it makes a lot more sense. It's like, oh, okay, it's a method call on the object M, and the method call has been dynamically created, blah blah blah. So there's immense value to learning Ruby. Like I think very soon, like you'll start to do things in your app where like you have to reverse engineer what Ruby Rails has already set up for you, and you can't reverse engineer it if you don't know Ruby. But I can do a lot of stuff without having to worry about Ruby. For example, I can even set up validations inside my model code. And the way I do that is with the aid of more DSL. So notice that I didn't create this. My application created, my scaffolding created this file, which is the code for handling data for mayors, right? Initially, the code is empty. So there's nothing you've added. All of the stuff that is happening when you say mayor.all, mayor.find, that's default. Okay, so it's not actually in here, right? We've not actually said what happens when you say .all, blah, blah, blah. That's all hidden behind you. It's available to you without anything. You can now add more language to do various things like model validations, model dependencies. So for example, if I say this, it is going to force Rails to validate that when a mayor is being created, the age attribute is in fact present. So if I go back, say new, I create no age. Oops, error. So what I did was I added a model validation. That's the Rails term for what I did. The model validation was added by using domain-specific language, and the structure is give me the name of the attribute you want to validate and the type of validation you want to do. Okay, so the initial part of like grokking any Rails guide is just getting familiar with a lot of these DSLs. And then challenging yourself to like do something that's not in the guide and searching on the internet, right? So for example, how do I, suppose I want to validate that the number is not negative, right? So I want to say validate age, make sure it's not negative. I don't think you can do that in a domain-specific language. Yeah. So sometimes the domain-specific language works and sometimes it doesn't, right? Like I assume it was default code that would take care of testing greater than, but it doesn't. There was code that took care of doing that. So a lot of like reading the guides is like, you know, you read the guide, it teaches you this, then you're like, well, I want to do something else. I don't want to test just for presence, I want to test for the actual value. I want to test that it's the age is not more than 100. I want to test that it's between 18 and 65. You know, so how do you do all of this? And usually the process is, like I said, knowing what it is called. So actually, let's try to like consensus around the search query that will get us the answer. Right? So what should I search for in order to figure out what the answer is? Any suggestions? Else validate integer positive. That's a good one. I like to notice that when Google tells you that your query is a good one, it's probably the right query. So I'm kind of cheating here, right? Like I typed in this thing, which I kind of consensused from the 8 people in this room. Turns out that is the right query because someone else in Google has already searched for that. That's what the browser is telling me, right? So yes, if I do that, validation for positive integer, I click on that. It's on Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is a good site. You usually get the answer. My fields are blah, 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 but it is not taking values this. What validation should I write? So I'll take positive, blah, blah, blah. And then this guy says, well, isn't it this? So you can say, maybe it is. You put that in there. Then I go back to my app and say mayors. I attempt to give her. It worked. I did not know this until I just did it. And honestly, most of my coding is that exact process. It is a process of saying, I want to do X. 80% of the time, Google says, that's what you want to search for. Don't worry about it. I then press enter. I get a result from Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is not always easy to read, as is evidenced by this question. So there's a lot of reverse engineering the grammar of someone whose first language is not English, I would guess. But you're like, it's good enough. This is pretty close to what I want to do, so ignore the rest of this. Usually the first answer in Stack Overflow is the right one, copy paste, yay, it works. This stops happening about a month into your coding. That's when you hit the sort of the Stack Overflow wall of like, I just read my 15 Stack Overflow answer and nothing works. So enjoy it while it lasts. In the beginning, it will last.
Keep the old age percentage true.
Oh, how do I keep it? Yes, good question.
And have that along with it.
Yeah, I can't keep track of all of the possible ways of doing this. I think let's test it. Yay. It worked. So yes, this works. The other way I did it, I know. I tend to remember one thing and then my brain sort of locks onto that and I just remember that. So this is, I usually try to remember the simplest way. I'm like, I don't remember if I can put them all in one line, so I'll just write it in separate lines. Writing in separate lines is also better, yes. When in doubt, write more lines of code. Always. There's no reason to mush things into the same thing. So yeah, so when in doubt, good code uses more lines than less. So that's kind of end-to-end. Like I said, this one of the ideas here was I was trying to give a sense of like the approach of my classes as well. It's really kind of conceptual. It's kind of like nuts and bolts. Try to bring in the helpers when necessary, but like focus more on like this is what's really happening. It will go into Ruby, so I will like teach a little bit of Ruby. So some of these concepts are not like what's going on while am I typing this kind of thing. Yeah. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to run through it. But hopefully it'll give you a sense of how like your apps tend to grow. Okay. So let's see if I can like do this with questions. So what would be the first thing I would have to do? I need to add cities as a separate entity in my database. So I would be. What was that, Andine? I model and controller by cheating and just scaffold it. But you're right. This would be to first create the model for a city. Controllers after creating models and just be a little more disciplined. Or do this fast. Having created a model and all of the scaffolding for the city in my database that represent cities, I can demonstrate that that is the case by and ignore the errors, creating a city. And I see that my transaction has been successfully committed. Therefore, I will expect that I will find the city when I type in what? What is the route that will work, because I know I created RESTful routes to give me a list of all the cities in my database.
See?
Yeah. So the scaffolding gives me that. Notice how I told Rails to create a model for city, singular, but Rails very smartly knows that the plural is cities with an IES. Again, a little piece of Rails magic. Why does Rails know that the plural of city in English is written IES? Because Rails is kind of cute like that. There's no real reason why this should be the case. It just is. Right? Okay. Now I want to be able to do something like cities, well, actually mayor, city name equal to Oakland. So I have to do two things. First, I need to actually process that, right? I have to take the city name and then extract the city for the mayor. But the more important thing I have to do is to create what is called a Rails association. So this is the part that is hard to explain. I'm just going to boom, 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 go through it. I create an association using yet model DSL method called belongs to. City. This means every mayor is associated to a specific city. I need to not only put this in my model, but I need to initialize my database to have a way to connect mayors to cities. The way you set up your database to reflect the association is by adding every mayor. What this says is, and when you sort of look at the documentation for associations, you'll understand what's going on. But basically what's happening is you're saying every mayor in my database will now have an ID, which ID will tell you what city they're a mayor of. And this is a migration. Remember I said migrations are when you make changes to your database. So you're asking Rails to generate a change to your database that does this. Once again, there's another thing that trips up a lot of beginners, that creating the migration and running it are two separate steps in Rails. And usually you'll like create the migration, you forget to run it, you get to your app and it crashes. So now all of my mayors will be related to a city. I will really fast through this, but there's a lot of stuff going on here. So I will then go back in here. I will then find myself a mayor. Second mayor is Edwin Lee, and I will say their city is city. Let me actually do that's the right way. So Jean Kwan is ID number 1, and that mayor's city to this city, which is ID 1. And then I save that into the database, and it says that it's set to city ID. All of this is using the association code that lets you connect your one model to another. In this case, I used association methods that connect a mayor to exactly one city. What if what was possible for mayors to be mayors of multiple cities? What was possible for one mayor to have many cities, or for one city to have many mayors? You'll then have a different kind of association, which is a many-to-many association, not a one-to-one. And Rails has model DSL to set up all these types of associations. Okay, and now I'll do the final step. I'll go back to my controller. Come on, where's my controller? Sorry, I lost track of where all my windows are. Go back to my controller, which is my mayor's controller, and then when I'm showing a mayor, I will ask which I said is inside the. So this much is familiar to us. right? We are getting the name of the city from the params hash, which is in here. The rest is not familiar to us. So I'm going to say, go find me the city that was passed in, and then I will. Oh, I didn't set this up very well. So I wish I could have said c dot, but I set up my association the other way around. So if I'd set it up correctly, my cities would have belonged to mayors, not my mayors belonging to cities. And then given a city, I can extract the mayor. Unfortunately, I didn't do it that way. I did it the other way. So now I have to do something very if found and add mayor code actually works, which is mayor, so it's already should be there. So now it should work if said yes, but it's not. Sorry, no, not actually. Oh, sorry. Let me see if I can actually do this. It's okay. There's a lot of stuff going on which my hastily written code doesn't quite work. So I was hoping to get it to show it's not what it's supposed to do. Okay. Okay, it's going through too many layers of Rails that I can't hastily like make it work. But that's basically what you're doing is you're trying to create associations. So I would say if you're trying to read stuff, like don't jump to associations. It can get a little confusing, right? So get comfortable with just like accessing database, changing values, scaffolding. How do you like test your knowledge of scaffolding a little bit or basic knowledge of model validations and just get familiar with DSLs by doing that, right? Like validations are a lot easier to understand, but they give you a way to like understand the basic like syntax of Rails pretty easily. And then you get to associations where it gets kind of hairy. For example, why did I design it this way? Why did I make mayors belong to cities? Because now I can't say, give me the mayor of a city, because I need to actually look through all the mayors and then get the city. But if you look at the way the DSL is written, the word here is belongs to. And in general, you want to write your app to reflect like the real world, in the sense that you don't want to say city belongs to mayor, because our cities don't belong to our mayors. Our mayors belong to our cities. So you'll find like a lot of Rails apps tend to try and use this DSL as if it reflects the real world, right? So like it'll say something like, doctor has many appointments. It doesn't say appointment has many doctors, which I mean, it's possible to do that and still make your app work, but you'd rather use your DSL to sort of be easy to read. So someone who reads my code, they're like, oh, I get it. He's trying to connect every mayor to the city that the mayor is a mayor of, because mayor belongs to city. Got it. If I'd said city belongs to mayor, it's a little confusing. It's like, wait, what does that mean? Do the mayors in this world like own cities? Like, what's going on? Right? So that's just like good like coding. It's more like Rails coding, like Rails conventions, I guess. Okay, 9:15. I will wait for questions, and I will stop there. Cool.
So you said the list place to start after doing this would be the DSL.
Yeah, get familiar with models, like the DSL for models. I would say pick model validations as one place to go. It helps you get comfortable with using validations, test your knowledge, like how do you suppose I have a name. I want to test that the name is less than 20 characters. How do I do that? So now you have to validate length. We saw a way to validate numericality for numbers, but we didn't see how to validate length of a string. So like I would say test your, like read the guide and then like search on the internet and like try to figure out what the way to do that is. And I think it's a lot easier to understand than associations, but then I would say like if you're down with validations, do associations. And I would say start with models, like get really familiar with how models work. And maybe then get into views and understand how like all of the views code works. Because when you get into views, the problem is you also have to understand that it's generating HTML. So in your head, you're having to track the Ruby that you're learning, but you're also tracking the HTML that maybe you're learning at the same time. So I think it's a little like, unless you know HTML. If you know HTML, then go to views, and you'll be like, oh, I see what's happening. It's adding to what you already know. But if you don't, then you're like trying to learn two things at the same time. So I would say start with models, get familiar, go to views, get familiar with that, and like sort of bounce back and forth. I think most guides like use that structure. They kind of like do a bunch of model stuff, then they'll do a bunch of view stuff, then they'll kind of go back to a bunch of model stuff. Yeah.
So what's the common software stack for Rails? Like, if you're using PHP, you use LAMP.
Yeah, good question. So for prototyping, I would recommend just use Heroku. See you guys later. Have you heard of Heroku? It's a cloud service for application deployment.
I've heard that there's so many. I'd like to have like an authoritative opinion.
Oh yeah, you're right. Well, there are others. I don't see why you would necessarily not use Heroku if you're just prototyping. If you're building production-grade apps, you could get into discussions of what is cheaper. Like there are other services now, and some of them are cheaper. But I mean, you go to Heroku, they have like really good manuals, and you can kind of get started with the Heroku like command line. Heroku has its own DSL. Heroku create app, Heroku deploy app, Heroku update app. I mean, so you got to like figure that stuff out. But their documentation is awesome. Do you know of any that are other resources, like cloud-based deployment resources?
Nitrous.
Cloud9 I'd heard. Nitrous I didn't know also did deployments. I thought they were just, but maybe they are.
It's just Cloud.
Cloud9, yeah. I haven't used anything else. I actually deploy my Ruby apps, my Rails apps, on Apache. But in order to do that, you also have to deploy an Apache module called Passenger. Passenger. So if you are a LAMP guru, you will not have too much trouble using Passenger. The Passenger guide is very easy. So if you're comfortable with LAMP, you should just use LAMP. So, yeah.
So the database would be MySQL. That's fine.
Oh, well, no. So Rails does not have a MySQL adapter. So I should not say LAMP. I should say LAP with two P's, or LASP would be like SQLite and
So how production, like what's the maximum scale that this can go to with that SQLite?
I don't know. I've never tried because when I use Heroku, it forces me to use Postgres. Postgres is a production-grade website database, so I never asked myself that question. When I deploy, even on my LAMP,
Maybe it doesn't have an adapter for messaging.
So all of this stuff we did in the console, notice that none of these commands assume your database, and yet they work. So that's because the default adapter, meaning the thing that will translate mayor.all into the corresponding SQLite 3 command, is through the SQLite adapter.
You can set up regular MySQL to be your database for Rails app.
Yeah, but no, I guess there is. My bad. Yeah. Oh, there it is. Well, that's for Ruby. That's for Ruby. So yeah, I was under the impression that there was no adapter, but this might be my.
So does that mean that most
Ah,
companies use Postgres with Rails?
yeah.
Oh.
You know what? I might have come this far and said, A, MySQL sucks. B, I don't want to install development libraries and stop reading. But maybe it's not true. Maybe there is a Rails MySQL adapter. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. Like even reading this, yeah,
I
okay,
know there definitely is.
okay, yeah. You're saying that. Well, yeah, but I would just use Postgres.
Do you know of any companies, enterprise or whatever, successful companies using Rails?
Oh yeah,
Oh, tons.
oh yeah. Rails is.
So, which ones?
I mean, like I know of many clients who are using for their sites, and their sites are up in like the hundreds of thousands of views, and they're running it on Rails. I can say that one of these invitation apps, like not Evite, but like
Android?
Eventbrite, yeah, because I heard a talk by a guy who works for one of those companies. So I know that at least sites, yeah, I'm sure you can find it, but I know that at least sites that handle as much traffic as Eventbrite are using Rails,
Okay.
which is not really high up there. So I agree that you might argue that Facebook does not use it, and for good reason or whatever, but
Yeah, well, Facebook is famous PHP. And
right.
Twitter, the biggest thing.
Twitter is Rails.
Twitter is,
Rails.
yeah, they
Transfer to
rewrote it recently, like 2-3 years ago.
Okay.
But it used to be in Rails. Yeah.
So what?
Ondine said Scala. So I have heard I don't write in Scala. I don't do enough coding to worry about typed languages, so I don't care. Scala, I've heard though, is much faster than Ruby. But I'm sure there are Ruby enthusiasts that say just use the right Ruby interpreter, use JRuby instead of MRI, and it'll be just as fast as Scala. I don't really get into those debates. Like I said, I'm not coding at that level to care.
Generally, they use lots of scale and curse, lots of caching to be able to make Ruby Rails.
Yeah, and I've never written an app where I had to worry about caching beyond the default caching. So Heroku will do some default caching for you. There is a gem that you can use to use CloudFront. So if you're really worried about your CDNs and all of that in your app, Rails has gems, which is the Rails Ruby word for libraries, that let you do things like connect to your CloudFront account, and it will upload all your images automatically to CloudFront, or you can just say like CloudFront image ID as a command, and it'll just like grab it for you and stuff. So, so yeah.
Are you gonna have classes that deal like primarily with CSS or HTML?
I don't think any of the Rails people do. Rails school people do. But Noise Bridge has another guy, Jeff Faden. You should look up his classes. He does front-end web development.
So any type of code you want to manipulate from a CSS standpoint in Rails is done within the CSS.
Within the
file
CSS, yeah.
in
Yeah. So the Rails framework mostly does not deal with front-end stuff.
Okay.
Mostly. There are some libraries that I know of, and I'm sure there are many, that have DSLs that generate front-end code for you. I know, for example, Gmaps for Rails, which is the Rails gem for integration with Google Maps API, has helper methods that simply generate the JavaScript block you need for generating a map. Right? So the JavaScript blob is something like x equal to Gmaps for Rails, x dot lock equal to x and y, x dot center. You have to like write that JavaScript, which in the case of the Gmaps for Rails gems, I know you just say something like generate underscore JavaScript. Like Gmaps for Rails dot generate underscore JavaScript. And it kind of gives you this default JavaScript. So some gems like give you the front end stuff, but like mostly you have to write your own front end stuff. Cool. Oh, yeah. One last question.
Yeah, if we wanted to get the name of the mayor by using in this example from the website, would it be
Well, so if I have,
the database?
yeah, if I haven't broken my app, this is what we were doing, which I have now broken. But let me try to. Oh, oops. Well, yeah. So basically, it would have been generated inside the HTML, and the specific place it view. So the view information is written like this. This was the view that was generated by the scaffold, right? And the scaffold will take every attribute in your model and put it inside a paragraph in HTML. So here's the name of the mayor being shown as like this name and then mayor name. So that's the specific HTML that the scaffolding generated. But you can go change it.
This code unrelated to code, but you say you teach another class that.
Right now, the class I'm teaching is I'm teaching a class. It is at Rocket Labs, but it's a 12-week class, and I'm in the middle of that with some students.
I see.
It's 35.
It was I think it was the total was 750, but it was 12 weeks, and then it was like 75 per week or 85 per day.
Oh, it's one of those 12-week ones?
Yeah, but I'm changing a lot of that because the 12-week thing totally didn't work. Like basically the problem was that someone came in 3 classes in and said, "Oh, can I just pay for today's class?" But it was like, "No, you can't because I'm at a very specific point in the class." And I'd said in my thing, like, you can't like drop in the middle. Like, you can take the first 5 if you want and only pay like this much. Then I was like, this is too confusing. People don't get it.
It was like an 8-hour day or something?
No, it's 3 hours per class, 12 classes.
I attempted to join. How many sessions is it going to be in this?
12. 12 sessions, so 12 weeks. No, not here.
Here's 2 sessions, right?
The next week's session is by Brad. It's not by me. It's by someone else. Yeah.
So, like, I know you're talking about the HTML class. That kind of runs, like, consecutive, like...
That does.
Is the Rails, Ruby on Rails, is it the same type of thing? Or are we, like, starting, is it just kind of, like, random?
Yeah, we are... So, yeah, Jeff is awesome. He actually has written a whole curriculum and teaches it like, I think it's 10 weeks or 12 weeks, and it's all free.
Yeah.
He has homework. He will look at your homework. It is like, I'm amazed. Like,
here?
Yeah, Jeff Faden's class, yeah.
So like for our next class for Ruby, would it be...
Well, so I know for a fact that Brad wants to do like one topic and go deeper into it, which is why he has the survey. So, but that's usually not the case. Like, we're getting slightly better at like predicting which class is going to come up. But we're pretty much like loosely like, hey guys, like we don't have a class coming up for next week. What do you want to teach?
Okay.
I want to teach Facebook integration. Done. Yeah, so we're kind of like that.
It's not the type of thing where it's progressive. Then it's pretty much like.
No.
You better
guys consider that? Because that seems to be a big request.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if like the rest of the teachers here have the bandwidth for that. Like, that's what I'm doing with my paid class. But I'm not doing that with the rest of the Rails School folks. Like, I'm doing that with someone else. Like, we are sort of working around trying to create a class. Yeah, so I'm doing that independent of Rails School. But Rails School themselves, like they haven't. I mean, it's a lot of work to put together a specific.
Where are you doing this at Rocket Space?
So I could do it at Rocket Space if I get lots of students in San Francisco. They have space. I live in Oakland, and I'm also advertising it in Oakland, so if I get a majority in Oakland, I might do it there. Yeah.
Could you let us know?
Yeah. I mean, feel free to email me. So email me, Samir at Rails School, so I have your email address. Or you can go to my website. webappsforbeginners.com, and there's a mailing list, so you can sign up there if you wish. Just ask me, and I'll sign you up, whatever works for you. And yes, I do intend to start something, so let me know if you're interested, like even roughly speaking, so that I can be like, oh, I've got 6 San Francisco, 2 Oakland, San Francisco it is.
And when is your next session starting for the?
Sometime in early fall. I haven't quite figured it out, but like after Labor Day. Yeah.
So I'm interested if that's an indication.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. Shoot me an email or just sign up or whatever.
I just signed up.
Okay. Cool.
But it says sign up for updates. I don't know if that.
I should get your email. So yeah. Yeah. So I will hopefully. Actually, it should have showed up instantly. But did it say it's successful? I'm using MailChimp, so hopefully
Yeah.
it's... Okay.
I saw the chin.
Okay, great. The one I'm doing will be paid. Yeah. And so right now I'm thinking 3,000. And it's 12 weeks. And it's a structured curriculum with homework, with like very specific like lesson goals and stuff.
What happened to the 750?
Well, that was sort of my beginning like discount rate that I had offered then, and I was like, okay, so should I keep offering the discount or just offer the full amount? And if you know what, if no one pays, like no one pays, and I've learned something. Whereas with the 750, I can tell you, I mean, no offense to these people who are showing up for the class, but they're treating it like a $750 class, which means that they don't do their homework, and it's really hard for me to keep them on task, and sometimes they don't show up, and they're like, oh, we can't show up this Wednesday, can you please do Thursday? I'm like, you know, wow, you are not putting a lot of work into this class, right? So I'm like, you know what, no, the class is what the class is, and hopefully that will motivate people to like really, like I'm writing all this homework, and I never get the homework back, and I'm like, come on guys, it's homework. so I think some of it goes into like the cost of the class, like if a cheap class, it's people are like, oh, well, whatever. I don't have to do my homework. Yeah, so. Cool. I will, yeah, thanks, man. Let me try to stop this.
This Rails guide that you kept mentioning?
Yeah.
Is that the thing that shows up in Google?
It usually is the top result in Google. It's also linked from the class page. Yeah, so it's the Michael Hartle. I think it's the Michael Hartle guide online, or maybe it's called Edge Guide or something.
So what is the other guy doing? Later this week, Mike Pratt. Is he doing